Hello. It is now time to recap the most recent Formula 2 race for RPL. Just like yesterday, we're doing something a little different here, and we're going to be giving you guys some content for the YouTube. Since we don't really have much up there, we're doing a review and preview for each tier. And right now, it is time for Formula 2. Let's go over the most recent race and talk about some of the recent changes. One of the biggest changes is now that we're racing with the F224 cars. We're no longer racing with the F223 cars, so it is good to have that change already kind of early on. I think last year it came more toward October, if I'm correct, or at least very, very late September. Now it came mid-September. You have a lot new liveries on the cars. You have a lot new team names as well. It's good to see those things at hand for season 20. I think it was round 5 of season 18 we had it happen. Now it was round 4 this season, which is the second season bull time of the game cycle, which is nice to see. But from Miami, Cookie took pole at his home race, which was very good to see. I think that was to be semi-expected. Cookie's got the speed. He has shown it in F1 before. Now he's shown it in F2 that he does have the speed too. He didn't really have the best of races throughout the weekend. He ended up finishing 14th in the sprint, and in the feature race he finished 5th, but he ended up having the 10-second time penalty to go with it. He really messed himself up in the sprint race, or excuse me, the feature race. Actually, both races. He messed himself up in the sprint race when the track was wet. Cookie went to wet tires and then went back to different tires. And if you remember, if you go back to super softs or you go back to, you know, the different tire, you don't have a fresh set for the feature race, and that did mess him up. And it actually messed him up even worse, having the 10-second time penalty to spare. But he finished 5th. He ran his own race for the majority of it. And yeah, we had 2 American drivers in the feature race inside the top 5. But with Cookie's pace, I think that's great to see. We need to see more of it. I want to see him run more of F2. He's not full-time, if I'm correct, so I'm happy to see him here on that aspect. Speaking of 2 Americans in the top 5, one of the other Americans we had is Goatley. Goatley finished in the points in the sprint race. He started 2nd alongside teammate Valkyrie. Ran his own race, kind of stayed quiet. Had some things go on, though, that were a bit interesting. But, yeah, we had him finish 4th in the feature. And we had him finish 7th in the sprint. And he got his best F2 results, so much love to Goatley there. Glad to see that. His teammate Valkyrie ended up, I guess you could say, having a resurgence. The female Brazilian driver ended up starting first in the sprint race due to qualifying 10th. And she looked more comfortable with these cars, which is great to see. During the F223 cars, a lot of the drivers tend to slide around, tend to lock the rears, tend to make mistakes a lot easier. And it's the reason some of these guys like RPL Tire and Iron and Minico stopped racing F2 for a little bit. So now that Valkyrie was back and on form, leading some laps, got passed by Jack Miles and held on quite a long time to 2nd place over Minico. That was great to see from Valkyrie's standpoint, that she was able to have a better race in these cars and actually get back onto the podium in RPL F2 and RPL as a whole. For her, she looked a lot more comfortable in these cars, even racing side by side. Her only incident that I can recall came with SV down at the hairpin. She's really not like the F223 cars, but the fact that she's been able to do well so far in our first weekend with the F224 cars shows a lot of promise. Maybe, just maybe, she can get back to the top step of the podium in RPL F2, which she's been up there 3 times prior. And our most recent time came back in season 18 at Zandvoort, beating Beatnik, who was really good on the F2 cars, but just never won that season. Maybe for Valkyrie's case, if she catches Jack Miles out or the other competitors in the sprint races, she can maybe do something herself, because she ended up finishing 9th in the feature. And maybe without some things that happened, it could have been better. Coulda, shoulda, woulda, right? Well, I think that's what some of the other drivers will be saying this weekend who had trouble. Let's talk about both Trident drivers, Blue Goggy and SLR Metal. SLR Metal started second and really just had a disastrous weekend. I feel bad. He probably wanted this weekend to be over after the trouble in the sprint race. Ended up retiring in the pits due to the trouble he had in the sprint, and in the feature, he only really recovered to finish 8th after the trouble he had. And it's not good to see, especially for someone who is just only a few points behind Jack Miles in the championship coming into the event and needing to score a lot. He didn't even pass Josh in the championship, who's not raced the last 2 weeks. And Metal started off really, really well with Josh for this championship hunt, but now we're not really seeing the same thing here. We're not seeing Metal be able to get these results that he was able to at the start of season 19. And if he wants to beat the defending champion Jack Miles, he's going to have to do a lot more than what he is doing. Another driver who's going to have to do a lot more is Blue Goggy, because Blue Goggy had a really great race in Canada the week prior, but for Blue Goggy, he was another one like Cookie who made the mistake of going onto the wet tire, then switching back. Screwed himself for the feature race. He ended up not finishing the event because he crashed on track. And for Blue Goggy's case, he crashed with Jordan earlier on, and there was an incident submitted to the stewards where Jordan retaliated. That'll be definitely looked at. But for Blue Goggy's case, Goggy does need to do better. Goggy needs to have more consistent races. He seemed to have it in Tier 2, the other full-time tier races in recently. But for F2, he usually had that quite a bit. Now he's kind of lost his footing, it seems, and not really had that happen most recently for him. So hopefully he can get back on the right path. Another driver who did seem to get back on the right path, returning to F2 this weekend, was RPL Jordan. He finished 4th in the sprint race, had some great battles going on there with Reese Dainty, and that was great to see Jordan back on form, Jordan back to his normal self in RPL. This most recent weekend, he started 5th in the sprint, finished 4th. We spoke about the retaliation. We'll see what the stewards do have to say about it, but he ended up retiring in the pit lane on lap 1. Another driver who returned as well was Minico. Minico actually had his best sprint race finish in RPL this weekend. 2nd place. Very good job to him. Him and Jack both started 7th and 8th. Minico really held on to Jack for a while, and then once Jack got away, there was no beating him. And then Jack's tires were wearing extremely a lot, I guess you could say. And although Minico started in front of Jack in the feature race, he finished 1.7 seconds behind him at the end of it. 2nd place for Minico is a really great return to see, and it shows Jack Miles is somewhat beatable. Jack Miles, your season 19 champion, won both the sprint race and the feature race. Last time we were here in Miami, the winner of the sprint race did go on to win the feature race, so I really think that's no surprise whatsoever that Jack Miles did that, but he had competition in Minico. It's just Jack Miles ended up being more consistent and the better driver throughout the weekend. Is Jack Miles beatable? Absolutely he is. But a season 19 champion and 2-time champion actually, is back onto his form, it seems. Fastest lap in the feature, in the sprint, also the fastest lap. The only points he did not get throughout the weekend was the pole point, and Jack Miles did end up taking over the championship lead. It's going to take a catastrophic ending for Jack Miles to be beaten here in the championship with this lead that he has now after sweeping the weekend, and Metal's disappointing weekend. But Jack Miles looked like himself and looked like an even better version of himself. He's now ended up winning 3 of the last 4 events, and actually has not finished worse than 2nd in those events that we've had as well. Obviously missed Portimao, Jack did. He didn't miss Australia, but he's ended up being on podium every single race this season that he's been a part of. And these new cars do seem to benefit him. I think I look at it more similarly to the F121 or F122 F2 cars. And Jack Miles handled those well, and he's handling these well. I think the only guys you're going to see beat him on a consistent basis when they're here is Josh, Skither, and maybe on occasion Cookie. I don't know. Metal as well. They're the only guys who I think can really beat Jack on the occasion, but even then, you've got to do it consistently if you want to beat him for the championship, and that's what Metal has not been doing, and I really want to see Metal get back onto form, but it's going to have to start with some consistency and a driver who definitely seems to thrive on momentum. I want to talk about a few other drivers briefly throughout the weekend that we didn't mention, and we're not going to hit on them too much, but we're going to talk about their races. Jack had a teammate this weekend, Andrea, who raced in F1 as well, which we'll get to later on, but Jack Miles' teammate Andrea finished 13th in the sprint race. Didn't have the best of events, but actually got lapped. And in the feature race, picked up a point for the team. And that definitely does help for the constructors, even if they only win it by 1 point. Andrea didn't really have the best of races, but came home in a point spot, salvaging a bad day. Reese Dainty started 17th in both races and finished 5th in the sprint after having damage, and finished on the podium in the feature race with the damage that he had in the sprint. He ended up doing better than that in the feature race with a 3rd place finish, right behind Minico, a second back. For Reese Dainty, he doesn't race in these cars often, so it's very good to see him put up performances like that, and hopefully he can continue to replicate this, especially considering that these newer cars, a lot of the drivers, like we had 17 drivers race this weekend, so hopefully we do continue to see the attendance rise up with these cars being favored by most of the community. Eric was just outside the points in the sprint race. He finished 9th and finished 6th in the feature race. A really good weekend from him. Faded Knights has to be happy with his drivers, Goatley and Eric and the others for sure. Even the camp boss of Faded himself finished 10th in the sprint. Didn't really have the best of feature races, having the speeding penalty, but Eric came off of a podium the week prior in Canada and still backed it up with a points finish. Night Owl, the Australian driver, started 11th in the sprint and finished 6th. So he started 11th at both events because of that and finished 7th in the feature race. If he did not have those mistakes, maybe it was a question of where he would have been, but he lost out to Eric by 9 thousandths at the end of the feature race. A very close finish, and one that was decided on penalties. There were some penalties that were handed out for track limits this past weekend, and it did affect some of our drivers, no doubt about it. For Night Owl's case, he was coming off that victory that we were talking about before in Canada that he had over Jack Miles. Optical was the last points runner in the sprint race, giving it a double prem up points finish. Optical didn't really have the best of feature races either because he just finished outside the points. His return to F2 didn't go to plan necessarily, but he showed some great promise, was in a lot of battles. Same with SV, but for SV, it looked like a better race than what he had in Formula 2, or excuse me, Tier 3 compared to Formula 2. He was not spinning out constantly. He definitely was having a tough time, we know that, but he wasn't spinning out as badly and as much. SV finished 12th in the sprint, and he ended up finishing 13th in the feature. For SV's case, it was not the weekend he would have wanted. Remember, this is coming off of his best result in Canada in RPL F2, and a weekend that was definitely forgettable with the racing he had with George. SV had some battles with Faded and Optical and Andrea and Valkyrie. He was a part of that train, which was going to be P9, but he just was not in it when it mattered and fell back. True Streamer Boy was another driver who didn't really have the best of weekends as well. He just finished outside the points, and there's going to be a lot of people heading into this next weekend to Imola hoping for a better weekend. And one of the things that happened in Miami that may happen in Imola was rain. We saw rain at the beginning of the sprint race, and it ended up being dry enough at the end to where there was no more rain, but the field was started on dry tires. Pretty much everybody in that sprint race who did not go to the pits for new tires finished in the top 10, but not the top 10 get points in F2. Just remember that. So top 8 get points in the sprint, while top 10 get points in the feature. Why will rain happen in Imola potentially? Well, let's tell you about it. Imola, last season, we had rain in the feature race only, if I'm correct. Well, if it was, I don't remember if it was in the sprint race or not. I'm going to maybe double check that now, but Imola's feature race was definitely chaotic, and it was chaotic enough to where our winner, Minico, first-time winner there last season, ended up finishing with a puncture at the line. And in Minico's case, it was his first win. He chose to stay out, and he actually nursed the tires homeward. Guys like Skither and Jack, they had to pit. They decided to pit. Others ended up getting a puncture at the end. You had Strat Racer, you had Andrea, Egg, Josh. There's somebody who did get a puncture at the end. One of the guys who didn't was RPL Tight Iron, who finished actually last of the runners. 1 DNF in that race last season, 17 drivers. Hopefully we see the attendance continue to rise up in F2. We have not seen it be great until this week with the F2 24 cars coming out. And a lot of the drivers throughout the community definitely seem like they like these cars a lot more. So hopefully that does spark an increase in attendance. I want to talk about the driver standings heading into Imola because although they're not updated from Canada, although they're only updated from Canada and not Miami, it's very important to mention that Night Owl will overtake Skither and Tadpole in this fight for P4. Metal does gain some points, but he does not gain enough to overtake Josh. So it's Jack ahead of Josh by quite the margin now. And Josh, I believe, has dropped down to a reserve role, if I'm correct. A big surprise there from Josh, one of our brightest F2 drivers that we've had in recent time. The thing about Jack that I want to speak about him with the championship lead is that heading into Imola, especially with where he finished and how he ended up last season, he ended up pitting quite early on and finishing third. With that being said, I shouldn't say quite early on, but quite late on, I should say, to avoid getting the puncture. And he got the podium, and he beat teammate Skither in the sprint, which was a 1.4 gap. So realistically, our favorite into this weekend should be Jack Miles. That's no surprise. I think there are some drivers who are going to contend. Obviously, look out for Minico. I believe, if I'm correct, he is back full-time. One of the other drivers who, and I'm just seeing it now in the driver contracts, Josh has dropped to reserve in Tier 2 and F2 both. So I hope whatever's going on there is going to get better for him with his personal stuff going on. But man second in the championship might be overtaking my Metal this weekend. And I think Metal is a favorite, actually, because this race last season, he had no setup, came in late, if I'm correct, and just didn't get the result. But he actually recovered to the field really well, but there just wasn't enough time. So I think Metal is one to watch out for as well. If Cookie is racing, he's one to watch out for. Skither. Even look out for Tadpole. Someone who raced well in this race last season, who we have not seen racing recently, is Strat Racer. Strat Racer, he's one to look out for. If Andrea races, this is technically a home race for him. JTK, by the way, got a new contract. He wanted me to mention that. He is racing for ART now in Kipu's Academy. Minico is racing in Kipu's Academy Invicta. I think for Minico's case, I think if there's anybody to take the fight to Jack besides Metal, I think Minico does it this weekend just because of how he performed in Imola last time. He was in the DRS train, even though it was no DRS. He was in the train for the longest time with Jack and actually put up more of a fight. But the only interesting thing about Imola last time compared to Imola this time is two things. Will it rain? And how will these F224 cars handle compared to the F223 cars from last season? Just a reminder, from Canada the week prior, it was Invicta leading the championship over Trident and ART. With Invicta's race with Jack, I'm sure they'll extend that championship lead. And track limits was a big conversation last season at Imola because the track limits are extremely absurd and over the limit. So we'll find out how that does end up faring this time around with the drivers. So this upcoming weekend, we are in Imola for F2, round 5 of season 20. Make sure you tune in. That is at 5 p.m. UK time. Can Jack Miles continue this good form and end up keeping the championship lead? Will anybody challenge him? And if so, who do you think will challenge Jack Miles? We've got quite a ways to go, and things can still change in the championship. That is for certain. We hope to see you on Saturday at 5 p.m. UK time for the next F2 race in Imola, which saw a first-time winner last season. We'll see if it sees one this season. Have a good one, folks. We will see you for that event.